Welcome everyone, and thanks for joining. My name is Lodewijk Gelauff. I will be talking about voting and participatory budgeting. I'll explain to you what all that means in a bit. But first of all, who here is familiar with the concept of participatory budgeting? Few people. Anyone participatory democracy? Anyone involved with cities? I'm just trying to gauge a little bit like what the room is like. Yeah, so I work at the Stanford Deliberative Democracy Lab. We work on different versions of participatory democracy and engaging people in the democratic process through less conventional means. And I have done my PhD and do still joint work with Ashish Goel's lab, the crowdsourced democracy team on the other side of campus in engineering. Today I will be talking about participatory budgeting, but we also have a number of other projects, and I would be happy to talk about those afterwards. Let's see how much time there's left over. Just as a little bit of background so that you understand where I'm coming from, there's a few different topics that I've been working on in the past years. One of them is structured conversations for an open-ended consultation phase. Really where you're trying to, if you're a city manager, if you're a government, and you want to engage people in like open-ended questions, how would you do that? So you can use, so we built a tool where you can use video chat, and you can do that at scale. So you can bring people together, put them in small video chat rooms, and they can go through a structured agenda and arrive at some kind of conclusion. A second tool that we've built, that has been built in our group over the past years, is for participatory budgeting, which is really focused on the voting phase, which is where cities can use to engage their residents in a budgeting process. And third, we're still working on different tools to get feedback from residents on city budgeting processes in general. So if the city wants to reevaluate like how they're spending their budget across different departments, how would you do that? Today I'll be focusing on participatory budgeting, but as I mentioned, I'm happy to talk a little bit more about the others as well. And later I'll quickly touch a little bit on some learnings that we had from the city budgeting feedback processes. So first I will be talking a little bit about like what participatory budgeting is, what you can do with it, what to expect. I will be explaining a little bit what the Stanford Participatory Budgeting Platform is. And then I will be going a little bit into the different voting methods that you can use in this kind of setup, and how they compare with each other, some of the research findings that we have come to in our research group. And I will be talking about different budget feedback processes that we have run over in the years. And maybe we can talk a little bit about what else is possible. I think it's safe to say that trust in politics and politicians is not at the highest point ever at this point. Whether it's in the United States or whether it's globally, I think that is an understatement. And while people may have doubts about elections, they seem to be still willing to be engaged in the decision process. They're definitely interested in affecting the outcome, in giving their input. Even when people complain, they do care. And in a way, interest in local politics, for example, has never been so high. We see that, for example, a lot in school boards, but often that is on a very specific topic. And they usually have a very specific reason to come there, and not always with a very constructive approach. And this involvement does not have to be limited, as they show, but as we will also see later, to electing your favorite candidates. When a community gets involved in decisions, that gives an opportunity to increase transparency and accountability at the governments. So hopefully it can also help improve the quality of the decisions in the process. I'm currently a postdoctoral researcher at the Deliberative Democracy Lab, and I'm also part of the crowdsourced democracy team where I did my PhD. And this team approaches this problem in a multidisciplinary fashion. So they create these theoretical models based on applied mathematics, and then they try to implement those in more like applied algorithms, and they try to then understand, like, how would we implement that in software, and how can we actually implement that software then with partners in cities to see how actual people behave. Because a lot of these applied mathematics, as some of you may know, usually make a lot of assumptions about people who are participating in it. For example, you are all-knowing, fully informed, totally rational, which sounds great and is really necessary if you want to do any mathematics on it, but it doesn't necessarily hold. So we really need to do some research to make sure that whatever is the outcome of such a pipeline, it actually makes a lot of sense. So that is where I was involved. We focus our efforts especially on the more complex questions, so things that go beyond yes or no, or A or B, like what we've basically been doing for a few thousand years now. This is where I think technology really has an opportunity to make a difference and engage people in the process better. We're aiming at solutions that are fairly representing the stakeholders, that are efficient in use, and most importantly, that can actually be used by regular people. It turns out that it's often the case in local questions. It turns out to be really hard to make a distinction between should we buy a submarine or an air carrier. Like, defense decisions are really hard to make for regular people. But if you have to make a decision whether you want to improve the playground or whether you want to invest more money in the library system, that is something that people can actually relate to. If you want to fill potholes or if you want to put decoration on the walls, those are decisions that people can actually have an opinion on and can be constructive with. Therefore, we collaborate with local governments especially, and sometimes with NGOs, by providing them with a platform that they can use to actually engage with these people. Our participatory budgeting platform is one of these, and it's currently being deployed in many cities. So we really value democratic participation in our democracies highly, and we usually have to limit our questions to questions that are really easy to yield answers. Choices, yes or no, Republican or Democrat. But even if you consider third-party candidates, the complexity really pales compared to open-ended questions, to budgeting questions, to questions that a decision maker is actually faced with when we're trying to engage their stakeholders. It's much harder to ask complex policy questions. And it probably is probably clear the problem. The number of possible answers to a single question of how should you spend a certain amount of budget is so much larger, and it's even impossible to write out all the different answers that you could give to that. So we will need to structure these problems a little bit more in a way that people can actually answer them in a constructive way, and that it somehow becomes tractable. So a natural category of problems that has some structure that we can use is participatory budgeting, or budgeting in general. But in budgeting, we have money that really helps us to structure the problem. We have a single dollar amount, which has a clear defined value. And within that category of budgeting, there's participatory budgeting, which has many different definitions. But in general, we have a fixed pot of money. We have a group of people that tries to come up with a preferred set of ideas, of proposals, of projects that they want to spend the money on. So this call for engagement is not really new, right? Like to get people engaged in the government, that's something that people have been calling for many decades, if not much longer. It is often even mandated to some extent in cities by federal law, but it can be limited. It can be as limited as, for example, a public hearing on Thursday evening at City Hall, where nobody really shows up, or where everybody shows up and gets to speak for 1 minute. It can be limited. It can be all the way from like information providing, where people may be able to speak but not really influence the process, all the way to like actually inclusive participation in, for example, some smaller communities. But it all starts from the principle that people on the streets have some unique insights. They have some unique information to contribute to the process that really could help the decision makers to make better decisions. They like to be engaged, and why not ask them directly in some way? How can we optimally tap into their understanding of their own neighborhoods? So participatory budgeting is probably on the more empowering side of that spectrum, all the way from like information providing to actually engaging people in the actual question. And the definitions of participatory budgeting range all the way from like from informal surveys where we're just asking people what is your opinion, to processes where residents actually get to propose spending items and actually decide on how their budget is being spent. The term is initially introduced in South America in the 1980s. Porto Alegre is often mentioned as the place where it started. And since then, it's spread all over the world with all these different definitions, different versions of it, and usually have some kind of allocating budget. So they have some pot of money to divide. It is essential that the stakeholders are, of course, participating in one way or another. Otherwise, you should just call it budgeting. And they are usually involved to some extent in not just the development of like what should be the projects, but also like how to actually how the money should be divided between those projects. So in the United States, a ward, a city, a district usually makes a budget available, like for example, like a few $100,000, $1 million. That's kind of the range that it often operates on. And they make the budget available and invite people to actually come up with a proposal. They do that in some kind of committee hearings, or they do that in like town hall meetings. And then they go through a public process where people are encouraged to develop those proposals and rigorously go through them and make them a better quality. Then they're often vetted by experts so that they're up to standards of the budgeting in the city itself. To make sure that the costs are realistic, that they're workable, that they're executable. And then finally, when there is a ballot with viable projects that people can actually decide between, it's being put to a vote. And that is, and often there's a rubber stamping step after that necessary, because not all states allow you to make these decisions formally through a vote like this. But the idea is, of course, that the chosen projects actually get implemented. Cities have been organizing this process on paper and in person for quite a while now. I think the city of Chicago was one of the first to do this in their wards. And proposals are often collected at town hall meetings, improved in subcommittees, but usually the voting happened on paper. And as you can imagine, nowadays this also is being considered to go digital. Especially in the last few years, this really took a flight. Our platform, for example, which allows you to do this digitally, has been used by Chicago for quite a few years now. And initially that started as digital voting booths on polling stations, so where you basically put a laptop out and people can vote that way. Recently it has been more and more commonplace, and cities can, for example, choose a digital platform if they want to reach more young voters, if they want to make it easier for people to participate, if you want to reach different demographics, or if you want to engage them in a more complex way, in a more creative way through the voting process. Many cities end up combining paper and digital voting in one way or another. Every step that removes a barrier to voting helps, because the turnout in these elections is often very low. So it's really about the engagement. I think if you have a process where you engage like 5 to 10% of the people, of the population, that's actually quite a high turnout in many of these cities. Because it's not happening during regular elections. It's happening as an off-cycle process. And getting so many people to show up for something is quite a lot of effort. So some interesting tidbits that I found in the academic literature about this process is that, for example, analysis from New York suggests that if you organize this process and you engage traditionally underrepresented minorities or underrepresented groups in general in this process, it increases the likelihood that they also actually participate in regular elections. We see that if people engage in a budget exercise like this, that it helps improve their understanding of budgetary issues in general. And turnout is often low, so we see, like I mentioned, like a 5 to 10% turnout is actually quite a nice result. So if you're interested in organizing PB, there's a lot of information online. For example, participatory budgeting from PBP has a lot of information. People Powered has a lot of information. You can always shoot me an email and I'm happy to connect you. But today we will be mostly talking about the voting process and all the voting methods that are out there. So as I mentioned, you can use online technology for this, but for that it's important to quickly identify, like, there's many phases in this process, and you can of course use this technology also in different ways. So you could, for example, decide to do the idea collection online. Or you could have your online meetings online, just Zoom or Google Hangouts, or like whatever, Big Blue Button, or like, I'm not sure what your city likes to use. You could use some kind of asynchronous solution where you let people improve on the concepts, on the proposals. But I think here we'll be talking mostly about voting, which is an interesting process. And voting is actually split into a few different phases. If you really dig deep into the definition, we're talking about a few different things here. So we're talking about elicitation, which is that is the question that we ask people, the ballot that they fill out. And then secondly, there's consideration, which is like the information that people are considering in front of them. Like, what is on the ballot, what are the descriptions that you write out, what is the extra information you give, what are the landing pages, etc. And then there's aggregation. Like, given that you ask people a certain question, there's many ways sometimes to combine that information to arrive at a certain outcome. So for example, you could think that if you just ask people to check their favorite project, there's only one way to arrive at a solution, but there's actually multiple algorithms that could let you arrive at, like, what would then actually be the projects that you prefer. We'll split those out a little bit. I'm going to ignore consideration for now, because that speaks probably for itself. Like, what information you put on the ballot is of course affects how people judge projects. Like, do you put images there or not, for example? Our platform has been in use since 2012. And allows you to organize these processes, the voting part of it, digitally, but also allows you to enter paper ballots into the system. It's currently used in a number of different cities, for example, Chicago, Cambridge, Vallejo. We've partnered over the years probably with about 50, 70 different districts, wards, cities, depending on how you define them exactly. With local governments, and help them distribute over about $100 million across these different places. Our goal really is to make it easier for these cities to organize it. The software that we made is open source and is available on GitHub. They can install it themselves and run it on their server. But we also made a version of that available on our own server, so that they just send me an email, I spin up a ballot for them, and they can just run with it. We're trying to make it as easy as possible, so that cities at least don't have the excuse like the voting is too complicated if they want to run a process like this. If you want to play around with it, feel free to do so. pbstanford.org has a number of sample ballots that is just live, where you can just play with it and just see what are the different voting methods that are available, what are the different interfaces, at least on the user-facing side. I will also take a few minutes to just show you at least a few of the different voting methods and what their screenshots look like. On the platform, the city basically gets to determine what goes on the ballot and what the ballot actually looks like. So the city, for example, gets to determine what the voting method is, what languages they want the ballot to be available in. They can add all the translations. They can decide how they want to authenticate voters and make sure that they are actually eligible to vote. They can register voters to the level of detail that they want. Some cities prefer to have a very thorough way to authenticate after the fact, like, oh, we only want people who live in certain streets or certain addresses, and we want to be able to check that. Other cities, they put more value on making it really easy for people to participate. So sometimes cities don't actually know who lives in their city, so then the only way to do is basically some very basic authentication, or they just use text messages to make sure at least one phone, one vote, which limits it to some extent, the abuse. And then Oh, and then they can set some different constraints for the ballot. And they can determine, like, of course, like what the project text is, etc. From the perspective of the voter, the process is fairly straightforward. So they arrive at a landing page. They have to authenticate in some way that the city determines how. They have then a primary ballot that they fill out. Sometimes they have a secondary ballot, which is for research purposes. If the city allows us to do so, we can ask the same question, the same projects, the same everything, but just with a different voting method, which helps us understand better how these different voting methods compare and how people fill out the same ballot with a different question. I'll show you later how we use that information over the years. And then finally, there's a demographic survey where the answers are totally separate from the actual ballot. So that those are not, so that the city cannot figure out like who voted exactly for what. So the city, when they want to set up a ballot, they have to make a few of these decisions. They have to figure out in advance like what languages do we want to provide for how to authenticate, etc. We briefly discussed that before. So the platform is really configurable in many different ways, and that allows the city to run it in the way that they see fit in their specific community. I'll go now into a little bit more of the voting methods. So participatory budgeting generalizes to a category of problems that has a natural structure that we can use. We can, for example, define a problem where we have a fixed overall budget that we can spend and a set of proposals which are predefined with everything has a certain cost to it. And every resident will have a certain utility, a certain value for every project, right? Like some people will appreciate the fact that there is a playground that is being improved, and some people say, well, children are out of the house, I don't really have a value for that. So people will have different values for different projects. And the question is now, given all these projects, like which of these projects would you prefer to be selected? And how do we then aggregate those votes together? You could, of course, achieve this in different ways. You could ask people, what are your favorite projects? You could ask people to rank the projects. You could ask people to do something else. There's a few basic methods that are usually being used, and these are at least the methods that are being supported on our platform. So the most straightforward one is approval voting, where we ask people, choose your 3, your 5 favorite projects. We don't ask you to distinguish between them, just choose your favorite projects. This is called K approval. Then there is ranking. We could, of course, ask people to rank all the projects. We learned very quickly that that is a lot of work, and it's a lot of mental load for people. And people actually are quite annoyed by it if they have to rank all the projects they really don't care about. So what we actually did is we simplified it a little bit for people. So we first asked them to choose their top K, like for example, their top 5 projects. Just choose the 5 best projects. And then we ask them to rank those. So that they can distinguish between the projects they actually care about, but they don't have to worry about all the down ballot projects. Then there is knapsack voting. I'll explain a little bit more in what that means, but that it basically takes into consideration the cost of every project. And finally, there's K-token voting, where you distribute tokens over different projects. So in K-approval voting, where we just ask people choose K projects, it's really hard to consider trade-offs between projects, right? Like you can have this one project that costs like $500,000 and this other project that costs 10,000, and like how do you choose these? So naturally, intuitively, you might maybe think like me that people would naturally choose the more expensive projects because they feel that their influence is bigger if they choose those. It gives you some odd incentives, and it's not really strategy-proof. And aggregation, even though it may seem straightforward, it's not always straightforward, because how do you treat the fact that if there's, for example, 100 people that prefer a project of $500,000 and there's 100 people that prefer 2 projects of 250,000, like which of them would you choose? But the advantage is that it's really easy to implement on paper. So on our platform, this is how we implemented it. I'm sorry, this is. It keeps slipping. Yeah, so this is how we implemented it. So basically people just keep choosing projects until they run out of tokens. Let me just try it this way.
And you can bend it.
Yeah, I think this should work. Yeah, so this is how we implemented it. And then for K approval voting or K ranking voting, we basically have this extra step. We now want people to also rank their favorite projects. And aggregation is even less straightforward, like how do you treat different rankings with each other? But it can be a paper alternative for knapsack voting. So in rank voting, they see first the same thing as in K approval, and then in the next step, this is they were asked to rank the projects compared to each other. Knapsack voting is where people are asked to basically take a shopping cart problem. So you have, for example, if your budget is $1 million, they can choose as many projects as they want until they run out of budget. And that way there's an automatic consideration of the fact that some projects are more expensive than others. This is what is in the literature is called a knapsack problem, hence the name. It allows you to simply combine the votes and just add up the projects, and that should take care of the utility challenge altogether. Which is actually hard to do on paper because you need to give people calculators and they need to type in all these amounts. But you can imagine that on a computer this actually becomes quite trivial. You can just keep track of like how many projects people have chosen, what the budget is so far, and just tell them which projects they can still select and which they can't. Under K-token voting, which is something that is still quite experimental on our platform, you allow people, basically you see this in a lot of strategy retreats where people have these little dots that they can put on a whiteboard or they can put on little sticky notes. You can distribute those tokens over different projects. And that way you can give different weights to different projects. So you can say, I give like 3 votes to this project and 2 votes to that project and 5 votes to that project. In people's minds, that is a lot more fair because they can really give this weight. But it's not clear how that would strategize into more expensive and less expensive projects. It's also, the nice thing about it is that it's a gateway to even more complex implementations, such as quadratic voting, where your first vote for a project is much cheaper than your second vote, which is really popular in some circles, but that is something for down the line. For aggregation, our platform currently uses Greedy, which is basically that where you just add up all the votes and you just tally them, you just count. That's the simplest approach because that is also really the easiest to explain to people. It's what people expect. So you just add the votes up, you rank the projects in order of the number of votes, and then you choose the highest ranked projects. In theory, there's also some other aggregation methods that are nowadays becoming more and more popular, at least in the CS literature. For example, the method of equal shares, which allows you to be more equitable with your aggregation. So for example, that way you can consider the fact that there might be a minority in your community that has a strong preference for one specific project that is different from all the other people. So you can imagine if 51% of the people agree on a specific budget and 30% really want this other project, like why shouldn't they be able to spend some of the budget on that project if that makes them so much more happy? So I will now transition to discussing some of the research that we have done over the past years based on implementations of the PB platform. First, I will discuss how we used anonymized voting data from our platform to better understand how voting methods compare in a practical setting. And then I will discuss the budget feedback exercise in Austin, if we have some time for that, to better understand what insights we can get from aggregating this data through clustering. So as you may recall, this was the process from the point of view from a voter. where people, they land on the landing page, they authenticate, then they have this primary ballot, and sometimes they have this secondary ballot, which is now really important for the next part. So they see two different ballots on the same projects, the same election. And we have these three different voting methods which are the most popular in our platform. K-approval, K-ranking, and knapsack. So we put together a data set of anonymized voting data where we have 124 elections, about 125,000 votes. We have about 1,500 projects, and for each of these combinations, and for each vote, we have the voter, the project, and the allocated budget. We have mostly approval ballots here, and also a number of knapsack and ranking ballots. If you add those up, you'll see that they're more than 124, because we also have, for 38 of these elections, we also have a secondary ballot available. So that means that the same people voted on two different ballots, if they wanted to. And why is this interesting? Because this unique data set really allows us to get a good understanding of the preference distribution per election, but it also helps us really understand what the completion time looks like for different voting methods, how much effort people have to spend to go through it. But it also gives us some vote pairs where people have the same opinion in different elicitation methods. And this allows us to get some correlation of the completion time and the abandonment rate with the ballot designs. If you make a ballot more complex, do people actually spend more time? And we can see what the effect of explicit and implicit constraints on your ballot is on how people actually behave. So for this, the building blocks are that for each election, we know the median time that people spend on their ballot. We know their abandonment rate, like how many people started the ballot but never completed it. Which allows us to look at this correlation between the ballot design and how much time people spent on the ballot. The second is we have these ballot pairs from the same voter in the same election, which allows us to compare their primary and their secondary voting method. We have also a lot of long K-ranking votes, which allows us to deduce if they would have voted with approval voting or with knapsack voting, what would their ballot have looked like? So you can imagine if we have a long ranking of like, I prefer this project than this one, than this one, than this one, you could basically go down the line and you say like, well, if you only were allowed to choose two projects, which two would that be? Well, that would be the first two projects. But if you would be able to spend $500,000, which projects would you have chosen? And you just go down the list, and you choose projects until they run out of budget. It's not entirely foolproof because people may have more complex considerations, but if you assume independence, that should work out. And finally, there's a randomized controlled trial between different voting methods when two different voting methods are selected for a secondary ballot. I won't bore you with all the analyses and all the data, but based on these information, there's a few conclusions that we think we can draw based on this. So first of all, if we infer knapsack votes from long K-ranking ballots, so if people are asked to rank a lot of different projects, that is a valid approximation. Now, I can see your faces glaze over a little bit. This is actually helpful because knapsack, as you may remember, is really hard to do on paper. But ranking is something we do know how to do that on paper. So if we ask people, if we want to do knapsack, and we want to also offer a paper ballot, then we can actually ask people to rank the top 5 or the top 7 or the top 8 of projects, and then we can do the math for them. And we have shown that you can actually use that as a valid approximation. So this is really helpful if we want to offer a paper ballot for knapsack voting. This was already claimed previously, but now we show that it's actually possible. The second conclusion that we were able to draw is that voters tend to select more expensive projects if they are asked to just choose 3 projects than if we give them a knapsack constraint. So if we tell them like choose as many projects as you want as long as you stay under a certain limit. So the average cost of projects goes down under knapsack. Interestingly, this is not across the board. This is mostly true for the tail of their projects. So this is not true for the most expensive project that they choose. They still choose that most expensive project, that $500,000, but they may prefer a $100,000 project over a $200,000 project. What we also saw, which really surprised us, and we'll need more research to really validate and authenticate this, but the data indicates that there is a positive correlation between median time spent by voters and the ballot complexities, which is what we would expect, right? Like if we make a more complex ballot, people spend more time. But what we don't see is that if we make the ballots a little bit more complex, then we don't see the abandonment rate go up. So actually, people don't say, you know what, this is too complicated for me, never mind. We see that people, once they commit to participating in a process like this, people are actually really interested to keep going. Of course, this is with lots of buts and ifs. We only make it a little bit more complicated. There's only a very small turnout, so maybe these are the most motivated people in the first place. So if you would do this for a full population, it may not work the same way. But this was a really interesting finding. And finally, what we do see is that knapsack voting, for example, does correlate with a higher median time and a higher abandonment rate, but the causality is really not conclusive. So it might be because cities that, for example, are willing to use knapsack are also more inclusive in their recruitment methods. Something like that might be playing under the hood. So it's really unclear what is causing this. So for next steps, there's a whole lot of things to do, but one of the things that is really happening in literature is this greedy aggregation versus method of equal shares. Like, how can we make a process like this more inclusive in its outcomes? How can we make this more equitable? And of course, we want to collect more data over time so that we can test all these other hypotheses. Let me see. I can talk a little bit more about the budgeting process we did in Austin, or I can take some questions. What would you prefer?
How long is this?
I can spend as much or as little time as we want.
Leave some time for questions.
You want some questions?
No, I mean, do that, but just leave some time.
Oh yeah, I will. Okay, I'll just try to do it briefly then. Yeah.
How do you propose we convince our local city government to try this out?
We need to get your voice on the recording.
How do you propose we approach our local city government and convince them to try this out as an experiment or to support this? Like, what should we do, basically?
Yeah, that is a question that is a little bit beyond the scope of because I usually only get involved when they're already convinced, which is really the best position to be in. But my suggestion, I mean, my opinion is as good as anyone else in this room on that matter. Is what I'm trying to say.
Talk to me about it afterwards.
But what I would suggest is ask that question before they get elected. That is probably a good start, but also let a lot of people ask the same question and try to show them some examples of what works.
Yeah, great presentation. So I'm curious, a lot of this, especially the voting mechanisms that you mentioned, have to do with ranking things in relation to money, right? Which is valid and makes sense from a budget standpoint, which is the topic of this conversation. I'm curious though, are you all looking at, or do you have thoughts whether this sort of platform can apply to even more expansive thinking? Like, for example, so let me give an example. I'm thinking about how certain, like for example, COVID, right? You know, the response to COVID, the money kind of appeared very quickly. Or if you follow the federal government, money seems to appear for certain key objectives, you know? And I guess I'm just wondering whether this approach can be applied like earlier to say, like, what are the important considerations that we should think about before thinking about money? Is that even valid to think about? And how would we engage citizens in that process? Like, does that question make sense?
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. I mean, this is, I spent, yeah, there's a lot of, it really depends. It's kind of a cop-out. It's kind of like a fake answer. But it really does depend on the question. It really depends on like what you're trying to figure out and how complicated it is, for example. So sometimes you can just do a survey, right? If everybody knows what you're talking about, if everybody understands the problem in like to the root, you can just ask a survey. You can just put a survey out and just let people respond, and that would be, and if you can get a representative sample, that's a good way to get people's opinion. But there's a lot of topics where that's not obvious. And at least the budget component gives people a common reference framework. It gives people a common understanding of like, what does a lot mean? Like, well, we're talking about dollars here, and that's something that people can at least, they can put some value. And of course, a dollar is different for one person or for another, but at the same time, we're in the end, we're talking about our community dollars, which is much harder for these qualitative questions. So that is why they're a little bit less straightforward, and they're definitely a little bit harder. But one of the ways that our group is working on that is through deliberative polling, which is where you basically try to figure out what people would say about a topic if they were actually informed about it. And that is by doing a survey before you have a deliberation, then you let them deliberate about the topic in a structured way, which has a lot of buts and ifs and a lot of constraints, and then you poll them again afterwards. And you look at the shifts in these pollings. Of course, simplified, but that is basically what you're trying to do. And that allows you to get a little bit more insight in all those complications.
Just a quick follow-up. Sorry, I was just gonna ask. I was also curious along that same line of thinking. Is a platform or approach like this, has it been applied to software like open source projects in terms of, because the currency is different, it might not be, maybe it is money, but maybe it's not only money, it's like effort, time required and importance and things like that, which again, like polling is one way to do it. I'm curious though, how could this be applied to how open source projects manage or decide what to do next?
That is a great question. I think I'm trying to think through this, because if you want to basically get an equivalent for dollars in an open source project, I think that is where the tricky part comes in. If you want to use these approaches of participatory budgeting one-on-one, because even though you could say time has a similar scarcity, but it's less well defined. You can measure it in hours, but at the same time, in an open source project, theoretically, the amount of time the amount of developer time available is unlimited. Theoretically, in practice, it doesn't work that way, and I think that makes it so much more complicated. So prioritization is probably something, but then at the same time, prioritizing one direction over another is really hard, because it requires you also to make an estimate of like how much time something will cost. But to some extent, you could use similar approaches as knapsack voting, for example, in time management, but it will require you to make a lot of assumptions.
There are many projects for voting and open source software scheduling. Josh Berkus has written one, and you can find him at KubeCon, I think.
I became interested in this after reading James Fishkin's book, Democracy When People Are Thinking. And in that book, there's a tremendous amount of emphasis on how the deliberation happens before the voting happens. How does the mechanism you're advocating here support the actual deliberation process?
It does not.
That's short.
Yeah. No, it's like, so the platform that we have, PB Stanford, is only for the voting phase. We're not claiming to do anything else. In participatory budgeting in general, like the whole process from start to finish, that has a lot of deliberation in it. So that is where you bring people together in this town hall, where people come up with proposals. They have to work together for that. Then they work together to improve the project quality. But that all happens before they get to the ballot.
So this is not like elections in LA where they just mail you a ballot. There is deliberation before you do.
Yeah, so in participatory budgeting, in most cities, again, there's a lot of different definitions out there. So there might be cities out there that don't do this. But in general, like participatory budgeting will have often deliberative phases built into it, because they really find it important that people connect with each other. They build coalitions. They try to figure out how you can engage more people in it. And I think that is also where a lot of the benefit comes from, a lot of the trust building. It's not necessarily from the voting itself. But then after that, it's also really important that it gets executed, which is also not always that easy. I mean, that it gets evaluated and reported back. So it's really a big pipeline that really needs to be executed front to finish, and we only provide a very small part of it, but typically a part that cities find challenging to do themselves.
It's maybe an out there question and somewhat related to this one, but is any of this sort of effort towards, producing these different voting methodologies, are they also being measured simultaneously in terms of the beneficiary spread of, success in an outcome?
So you mean who benefits from the outcome?
Exactly.
So,
I guess I, just put that in there, and I'm sure it's already in your mind, and that is, there's always, it depends on where, but generally, it's always those with more leisure time, those with more money, those with, other sort of features that, motivate them more or enable them more.
yeah, so that really depends on how the city organizes it. Usually I'm not involved in the recruitment of the participants, but it really depends. What I've seen I've seen this from the sidelines a little bit, and I do see that in some cities, you see that there's being a lot of effort being made into recruiting people that are not your traditional voters in elections. And you can see that in language statistics, for example. You can see that in what kind of devices people are using sometimes. But especially the languages, you can see that some cities make a lot of effort into making ballots available in a lot of different languages. And in some cities, you see that also those languages actually get used. And that is when you know that these cities actually make an effort to go out there. I've heard stories from some cities that said, well, the only way that we can actually get to those people that typically don't have the time to come to these town hall meetings, at least they try to go to the bus stops and catch them when they're waiting for the bus anyway. Do you have 5 minutes to fill out this ballot with an iPad or with something? It's not perfect, but at least you get them engaged in one part of the process. To get them engaged in something that will take them several hours, that is much harder. Yeah, sorry.
Do you find, since there's money on the line, in every situation I've ever worked in where money is on the line, there are always people trying to game the system to get more money for themselves. So what type of security do you use to deal with adversarial, attacks or somebody trying to shift the budget for their own favor?
It is surprising, but I have not seen a lot of that adversarial behavior in these processes, and that is probably part of that is because it's relatively small amounts of money, and the projects on the ballot are predefined. So at least when it gets to the voting stage, all the projects are at least beneficial to the community. They're not very, very personal, right? It's not like I get $100,000. No, it's like the $100,000 goes to improvement of the playground. So that is my personal guess, but this is going a little bit into the speculation direction. What we do see is that the cities have to always make a trade-off between security, how do you keep people from voting multiple times? And on the other end, how do we make sure, and that is where your question comes in, how do we make sure that people that are not your typical voters actually get to participate, that they don't give up before they even see the ballot because they have to give out too much personal information and they get scared because ICE might be on the doorstep next week because they give out all this information to the government. Or how do you get teenagers involved? There's a lot of cities where they lower the minimum age to 12, 13 years old. So there's always this tricky balance to strike, and a lot of cities end up with basically one phone, one vote kind of approaches where you use text messaging. So you enter your phone number and you get a text message with a code and you can log into the system with that code. It's fairly straightforward. It's probably not entirely foolproof, but it is at least something. There's one system, interestingly, so that's the part I skipped over. In Austin, we did a budget feedback survey in 2020, And 2020 was also the year where George Floyd was murdered, and it happened in the middle of that budget feedback process. And if we look at that, if we look at the number of votes that happened over there, just as a warning, this is a logarithmic scale. So you see that there's a huge bump in number of participants. And initially, our first thoughts were, well, there must be something malicious happening here. And we dive deep into the data and try to figure out, like, what is going on here. In the end, it turned out, well, it's because George Floyd was murdered. And part of the questions on the ballot or on the survey was how much money should go to the police department. And people really cared about that at that point. So we saw a large shift in turnout, but we saw also a large shift in opinions. And that is, I think that is one of the lessons also, like even if it looks suspicious, but even if you look at like who voted, we saw that 80–90% at least was directly traceable to the region of Austin. So at least people that were somewhat local. It's not like they recruited people from all over the country. And this is with huge peaks. So I have never seen anything even close to this. And I've seen a few elections, at least on PB now. So it's usually, I mean, yeah, knock on wood, but I don't have signs that malicious behavior plays a large role.
I think we have time for one more.
I'm sorry, I had to step out for a minute, but so you guys work specifically more with kind of larger budgets, city type size budgets, right? Have you guys worked with any organizations to encourage either the use of your design or similar designs into maybe a smaller scale, like tenant unions or mutual aid organizations, to kind of encourage a smaller grassroots level participation in this type of budgeting voting system?
So while the flashy examples might be big cities, that's not where the bulk of our ballots actually are. So a lot of the ballots are either very small cities, small communities, sometimes a few hundred people. Sometimes they're NGOs that are just really caring about a specific community of people. Sometimes they're NGOs that are more like an association style. So you can definitely do the same style of thing with participatory budgeting. It's just that we see it a lot happen because most of the cost is not in providing the budget for it's only part of the cost in providing the budget to be spent. But a lot of the effort also goes into recruiting people to actually participate. And that is usually the hardest part to actually make happen.
All right, other questions? Looks like everybody wanted to ask questions before we got to your Austin example. Well, thank you very much. It was very informative.
Thank you. And if there's more information on the slide, and feel free to shoot me an email or catch me afterwards if you're interested in more.